Again, welcome to our budget discussion about where our money goes. As I stated before the recording began, please make sure to ask any questions that you have. Type the questions in the chat. If we have time at the end, we can go live, but in the meantime, to make sure that your question is recorded, just kind of type it in the chat, and we will do as we always do, and go through the chat and answer any questions that you have. There aren't as many slides in this presentation simply because we know that there will be several questions, and we want to make sure that you ask the questions, and we will do our very best to answer those questions. So Terrence, are you ready?
I hope so.
Awesome.
So thank you again for joining on this. And this is the next to last of these, so you won't have to set aside time in the future for this. Andre, if you can give the land acknowledgement, that'd be fabulous.
On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Cochalish people, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continue to honor and bring light into their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, learning, and Zoom space. We ask that you take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers. And if you would like to go a step further, Julius is going to add where you can also do rent for the Duwamish tribe as well. Thank you for engaging.
So what we're going to try to cover today is, again, more of where does the money go? And also, how has that changed over time? Because that's a really important thing here. The source for all this information, the data, is a file on the operating budget that was taken as of June 26th. So there's just a little bit of actuals that probably isn't captured, but not much at all. So it's also super important to note that transfers are excluded because those can confuse things. So when you look at our operating budget over the last 4 years in terms of the actual spending, you'll see that it actually has gone down from 2016-17, which might be a surprise given that we're talking about increasing deficits and that type of thing. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but the overall picture is one of, pretty stable and in fact a slight decline over time. If we look by area or department or division, I'm not sure which title to use, you'll see that in administrative services, budget is in the blue, the actuals are in the orange. So as you can see, back in 2016-17, actuals exceeded by the budget by quite a bit. And again, in 2017-18, actuals exceeded budget by quite a bit. And more recently, well, two things have happened. One is the budgets, as you can see, have steadily increased. And that's because COLAs and everything are always being added to the budget. And at the same time, the actual expenditures have stabilized and gone down a bit. Now, that is really a reflection of vacancy savings, unfilled positions and so on, which from a pure budgetary point of view are great because we don't spend as much money. But from an operational and a functional point of view, it's a problem because what happens is the employees who are trying to do the work of many people get overburdened, overstressed, things don't get done as quickly, and you make more mistakes when you're spread too thin. So it's one of those things, a double-edged sword. So I'm just going to go through each of the major areas, and you can kind of see the patterns. So in instruction, you'll see that the budget, has been increasing. One more thing. Each of these things, it's always sort of a judgment call as to where to draw the cut line on a graph, because depending on where you could draw the cut line, you can give a really different impression. And when I say cut line, I mean the vertical scale. So this one is starting at 16 million and it's going to 30 million. And in each of these cases, I've tried to draw the cut line at about the halfway point. So if it's a $30 million budget, I'm trying to draw it at, $15, $16 million. That way you can see the change. Whereas if you draw the line at 0, it's really hard to see the changes. So in any event, the budget, has been increased. Now this last year, 2021, we did back in the spring anticipate some budgetary problems, not as large as the ones we had, but some budgetary problems. And so there was a reduction in the instruction budget. And in large part, that reflected the fact that it had been underspent, in the previous year. So this is a pattern for instruction. Student services, again, you see this increasing pattern of the budget, but the actuals have actually been significantly below what the budget permitted. And so maybe there are more vacancy savings, turnovers here. And it's also possible that the way the budget transfers work, because I've excluded them here, may have distorted this picture a little bit. Institutional support, which is, essentially all those things reporting to the president. As you can see from a budgetary point of view, it's actually increased quite significantly. And it has also increased in terms of actuals, but not as much as the budget has increased. Faculty, as you might guess, sort of parallels instruction to a significant extent. So you see, and this is both full-time and associate, part-time faculty. And it includes instructional faculty as well as, stipends for course development, that type of thing. So the actual expenditures dropped for, about 3 years, from 2016-17 to 2018-19, they went down. And more recently, they've gone up, and that is in part a reflection of the both the changes in the collective bargaining agreement and the regional cost adjustment recognition that we received through the legislature, which is a great thing, because I think everyone can agree that the cost of living in King County is elevated and continues to elevate. That said, again, the faculty budget for 2021, and this is like back in March, a decision was made to reduce that because there was some room given the enrollment trends and everything we expected. Classified, again, the blue line, the budgetary story, is of increasing budget, but the actual story is one of the expenses not changing much in the last 4 years, and that again is, it's a vacancy savings issue, and perhaps I don't know, it could be that we're seeing some exodus of more senior classified employees as they retire, and the newer ones are hired in a lower rate. That's just speculation, of course. The point, though, is that in terms of actual expenditures here, classified has not really seen an increase. Exempt, on the other hand, the last 2 years has seen somewhat of an increase, of a little over 10%, basically, in actual expenditures. And the budget has increased significantly beyond that. So that is an area of has been an area of greater growth over the last 4 years. Again, you can just see a slight downtick in 2021 in terms of the budget, because we did, make some minor adjustments back in March. So that's the overall exempt picture. But exempt, as you know, is not one group, right? Exempt is multiple different groups. I wanted to share what that looks like. So the blue are so-called executives, and that's basically and this is budget. Okay, the actuals are lower. You saw from the previous slides, the actuals are lower. But from a budgetary perspective, the executive group, which is basically the president and the vice presidents and so on, has gone up by a significant amount, percentage-wise, relative to the managerial group, which has also gone up, but less significantly. The managerial group are like directors and deans and so on. And then the professionals, those of you who have who are exempt and have specific technical skills, you may be analysts, that type of thing. That is, increased through 2019-20, and then it sort of took a bit of a dip. And finally, the yellow are just the executive assistants to the, to the president and to the vice president. They have their own category for whatever reason. So that's sort of a picture of how the exempt budgets break out.
Terrence, there's a question from Brianne. Does this only include state-funded positions or also grant-funded positions?
It does not include grant-funded positions, but it does include what they call 146, those funded out of International and Running Start. This is all just data, right? And I think the most important thing here is the context, because numbers, are just numbers. The context of operations, though, really matters. So it's what is driving the workload that results in the expenses, right? So I'll use an example. The facilities, which we talked a bit last week about facilities, the cost per gross square foot. In other words, how much did it cost to service a gross square foot of the campus? We have 775,000 square feet of facilities to maintain on this campus. And the budget back in 2016-17 for maintaining that was a little over $4 a square foot. Now, as you can see, the actuals were about $5.50, so quite a bit more. It's also true that if you look back a little further in time, they've been consistently under budgeting. So some adjustments were made in 2017-18 to the budget, didn't quite catch up to the expense. But as you can see over time, by 2019-20, did. And in 2021, it's again another incremental increase to a little over $6 a square foot. But when you really just look at what the actual expenditures were per square foot, in other words, how much did we spend on custodians, maintenance staff, ground staff, natural gas, electricity, sewage, wastewater, et cetera. Over those 4 years was a 5% increase in the actual cost per square foot. So, it's basically a little over a percentage point a year, which, for overall inflation is 2%, that's actually some decent cost control. So let's look at a different metric, because we are an educational institution, and what we really, our workload is driven by students, right? So if you look at the two areas that are most directly affected by students, right, in the student needs and responding to student demand, are instruction and student services. So what this graph shows you is the cost per FTE if you combine instruction and student services. So back in 16-17, we budgeted about $5,600 per FTE. I mean, that was, when I say we budgeted, that's a bit of a misnomer, because what I did here was I said, okay, given the budget and the number of FTE we enrolled, what was the budget per FTE? The truth is that at the time they developed the budget, they didn't know how many FTE they were going to have, and arguably it may not have been part of the calculation. So what you really need to do is look at the actuals, which were in 16-17 was about $6,000, just a touch over $6,000 per FTE. And as you can see, 17-18, it went up maybe $6,200–$6,300 per FTE. By 18-19, we were, $6,700 per FTE. Last year, it cost a little over $7,000 to do the work of supporting these students in instruction and student services. So what is the work? The work is, of course, teaching them in the classroom. The work is providing tutoring services. The work is financial aid support. The work is advising support. The work is registering students for class. All those elements, the purchase of equipment for the labs, the development of new courses, that type of thing. That's all incorporated into these costs. And as you can see, for the 2021 budget that was approved back in March, that's expected to be almost the same on a per FTE basis from a budget point of view, because what we did do was last year, which is for this year's 2021 budget, we did actually have an enrollment projection number, which was a decline in enrollment, and we did reduce some costs so that the cost per FTE of instructing and supporting those students was pretty much held constant. Having said that, you add this all up and do the math, and over the course of 4 years, we've seen an 18.8% increase in the actual cost per FTE for instruction and student services to support those students. So it's closer to 4% plus a year increase in costs. Most of that is, I think it's fair to say, is driven by two factors. One is that we do continue, we have over the last few years received cost of living adjustment funding, and we have received the Puget Sound regional pay bump. Some of that is covered by the state, not all of it. And we just see this decrease in the number of students, so we just have sort of a disproportionate increase in the cost of serving those students. And of course, where do we meet most of the students, and where's our biggest single cost factor? Well, it's the faculty, because they are the ones who impart the knowledge to our students. They're the ones who advise our students in their academic, not from a academic progress point of view, but support them in their development and stuff as people in the sense of as scholars. So this is the faculty cost. How much it cost us and this, by the way, is just salary. It is not, didn't split out benefits. Okay, so this is just salary cost per FTE. So back in 2016-17, we budgeted about $2,200, and now we're budgeting over $3,000 per student, of faculty costs per student. Now, the actual, of course, is different. Back in 2016-17, we actually were spending almost $2,600 on faculty compensation in the form of salaries for every student we enrolled. And that sort of incremented up a little bit in 17-18, but not that much. Took a fairly significant increase in 2018-19 to about $2,800. And this past year, in 2019-20, it's about $3,200, which is pretty much the level at which we budgeted it for next year. Or when I say for next year, I guess we're now in next year. And that's the sort of the baseline that's part of the budget where we've said, or we've shared that there's a $6.5 million structural deficit pre-COVID. And just to give you some context, we are still waiting for the district to give us their final calculations, but based on the year-end close, when you include all funds, we look like we lost about just shy of $3 million last year. So this is not abstract. So when you look at this cost, the faculty cost per FTE over the last 4 years, the change, it's a 28% increase in the actual cost per FTE over 4 years. So that's about 7% a year. So these sort of disproportionate changes in expense relative to the population we're serving really lie at the heart of the challenge we face, because we have not adjusted ourselves to our changes in enrollment. So that said, let's go back to the larger context. Whoa. Which is, again, if you look at the breakdown expense-wise, some of you, I know when I was initially speaking to you, said, well, our budgets, have not increased. They're going down, or they have gone down. We took some big cuts, and that's true. So you can see, and these are actual expenses. This is not budget. I thought actual might be more helpful. You can see, for example, in instruction, today, when I say today, last year, the costs overall were lower than they were in 2016-17, and they'd gone down for 3 straight years before 2019-20. So in an absolute sense, definitely some changes there. Student services, you can see, pretty constant, a slight increase, but not huge. I mean, these are $5 million increments, so there's some money hidden in there, but nonetheless, it's not an enormous change that you can just sort of go, wow. Institutional support, it's a lower base, so it's sort of a little harder to see, but that's increased a bit. But again, doesn't leap out at you. And administrative services, which is facilities, the business office, and so on, that too is pretty steady state. So it is not about, our challenge is not about the sort of absolute spending levels. It's all about what we're doing relative to the population we serve. Because the overall, if you kind of add it all up, again, just the operating budget, you're seeing that our actual cost per FTE was around 7,500 back in 2016-17, and now it's a little over 9,000 in 19-20, just the last year that finished. And if you look at our budget, of course, it is higher than that for the coming year. The overall increase in actual cost per FTE has been 20%. And needless to say, if you divide that, then you come down to about 5% a year over the last 4 years. And the legislature, well, at best, they give us 2%. So that's at best, and they don't quite reach that standard. We do have a 2% tuition increase, but in either case, we're 3% short, right there every year, every year. So that is the heart of our problem. And I know I've been sharing, kind of all these expense components with you recently, and at the very beginning, kind of went over revenue. What next week's presentation is going to be is it's going to be putting it all together to give you an understanding how all the elements fit together with the best insight we can provide into the 2021 actual situation. And I'll lay out a few different scenarios so you can see basically what the original budget was and what that looks like. Then there will be, to our sort of best estimate based on our current thinking, current information from international programs, current summer enrollments, feedback we're getting from Running Start and that type of thing, what we think things will look like, and then sort of a high-low type scenario so you can kind of see how all these pieces fit together. And that, of course, is something that the Budget Advisory Committee and the executive team will be looking at as we try to decide what recommendations to make to the president, who will then take her recommendations to the chancellor's executive committee at the district, and then on to the board of trustees ultimately once the chancellor approves the plan. I think it's fair to say that if I recall correctly, executive team's meeting on next Tuesday in the afternoon to make the decisions. It'll take the better part of a week to make sure they're all kind of incorporated into an actual budget proposal that then goes to the chancellor's executive committee for review and discussion. So I would anticipate that week after next, we would be in a position to share the recommendations that are going to the chancellor's executive committee with you. When I say that, it will not be in enormous detail because of a few things. One is that we don't know what the ultimate decisions will be because we don't make those. Those are actually made by the board of trustees. And it would be really, I think, awful to, to share a level of detail that would be personally distressing, but perhaps unnecessarily so, right? And the other thing is that we need to engage the unions that represent employees with sort of detail items and work through and discuss those prior to any action being taken. So there's sort of two, there's the process that goes through a chancellor's executive committee and then ultimately to the board runs parallel to a process where there's some engagement with the unions around effects of decisions and that type of thing. So that's a very long-winded way of saying we're not going to be providing detail, but what we can provide is information such as, well, there are this many positions involved, and that type of thing, and we'll do our best to give you a decent sense of the recommendation that's going to the chancellor's executive committee, its scale, and where the impacts will fall generally. And at the same time, we will necessarily have to maintain a certain level of confidentiality because of the nature of the situation, which is to say, both something that calls for a lot of discretion and sensitivity, and something which is not final until the board of trustees approves it. So with that, I will turn the floor over for questions.
Yeah, there are a couple questions. Honorio Todino wants to know if we know how we compare to other colleges like Shoreline.
I can't tell you about Shoreline, but I can tell you that South Seattle has last year a deficit of $6 million, which is structural. So we only had 3, so a little less than 3. So we're doing better in South Seattle. And I believe Central also is, for this coming year, because they've got a little different view on it, is also looking at a $6 million structural deficit. So we're in the Seattle district, we're probably a little tiny bit better off than the others, but not much. Shoreline, I can't tell you.
Right. Marla Lockhart said earlier in the presentation there was a slide labeled institutional, and it says, I believe, just after executive budget, that showed a significant increase about 3 years ago. Would you be willing to elaborate? It shows what I believe is the greatest increase yet without discussion. Thank you.
I'd love to elaborate, but I actually don't know what is underneath that. Perhaps somebody else here does. I don't know because I
Terrence,
just don't know.
if we're talking about the institutional part, Myra, I don't know if you're talking about where the institutional part is really in the presidential unit. That would almost recommend to say that's where we added beyond the EDI roles also too. So just adding my position alone will bring it up to what it seems that's a significant jump. So I think I can speak to that part. Oh, Peter's saying yes. So okay.
This is Stephanie. I would
Thank you,
also
Andre.
add that the 2019-2020 academic year was the first year since I've been here where we had a full-time FTE at our senior research analyst position. Prior to that, it had been anywhere between a 0.6 and a 0.4. So, and that was when Jerry Woodard was working here. So that might account for some of the increase in in that budget amount, but that would certainly not be the entire amount.
So Terrence, there's a question from Jim Jewell. The CEC sent a letter to faculty that conflated the concepts of fairness and equity. How does our executive team understand those concepts, and how does that understanding impact the approach to the budget process?
Well, that's a darn good question, Jim. We actually have a meeting at 1 o'clock today where we're going to be doing an initial review, and I'm sure that will be part of the discussion. So
Right, and recognize that equity is more than about the faces. It's about the again, keeping student focused. It's about the different employee groups. It is about how equitable our portfolio is, if you will, and that's something that some of the other colleges are suffering from, particularly South. We're trying not to put all of our eggs in one basket here at North moving forward, so that when, not if, when we have these economic fluxes in the future, we have some balance in our, if you will, our academic portfolio. That's so important. And then as far as equity is concerned, I'm assuming, Jim, are you talking about racial equity? Or are you talking about, the different employee classifications? Could you be more specific? Because we are looking at everything. We're not just going for low-hanging fruit. We're keeping it focused on the students and our core functions and what's required for accreditation. And there's a lot of empathy and conversation going into this. So we're not just cutting, or proposing cuts to specific groups and that kind of thing.
The specific reason I asked that question was the CEC letter was in response to concerns about the approach to furloughs, which are being applied fairly and equally across all groups, but impact those groups differently.
Yes.
Our frontline workers losing a furlough day is much a bigger impact than our executives. Fairness and equity, therefore, are not the same thing, but the Chancellor's Executive Committee is talking as though they are. So I'm wanting to know, how does the group that's making decisions on our campus understand those concepts to be two different concepts?
And DeAndre can chime in here as well, but yeah, we do actually understand that. And Jim, I actually have said in CEC, and I don't mind telling this group, that we can't furlough our way through this budget crisis. It is not possible for us to surrender that much of our well-being, whether it be at the presidential level or whether it be, in capital facilities, wherever. We cannot do that. It's just not going to work. It's too big of a cut to fix. So I can't speak to the tenor of the memo. I didn't get that from the memo, but the fact that you did is important, and I have no problem taking that back to the CEC. It's all about, perception, and we're trying to be transparent, but I will absolutely relay that message. But know that this team understands that, furloughs, we can't fix this. This is structural, and as you all have seen over the past few weeks, it's been going on for a minute. And also keep in mind that when the legislature meets in January, we'll have some other things to face. And that's why we're using the approach that we're using, because we know something's coming from them. We just don't know what. And so we're trying to be prepared in a strategic way so that we are not having a knee-jerk reaction to having to streamline our operations.
Yeah, just as a point of information for all you folks, as you know, the district is about $8 million of our expenses. You know, as we pay to the district. And I was informed that they are going to cut their budget, that we could sort of plan on them reducing by 15%. So that was
that helps us
positive. It's helpful.
Right.
And I'll say thank you, Jim, for always being vulnerable and speaking truth to power.
Absolutely.
And one thing I see in the chat is from Lyle about an opportunity of growth. I do just want to speak that the BAC community is definitely looking at that too as we're having these conversations. So just want to speak to that.
Also, a question from Dr. Borges, Terrence, in the cost FTE that included instruction student services, about 3,100 of 7,100 is faculty. Can you give us a window into what constitutes the other 57%? I am assuming that there are numerous categories that fall under instruction and student services.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, there are a number of services which are kind of in that big window category that directly pertain to, you know, directly serving students. So that would be, for example, the tutoring center. That would be advising. That would be financial aid. You know, all those kinds of direct services. It also incorporates the administrative components of both instruction and student services. So the deans and the directors, the administrative staff that's, you know, processing POs, travel requisitions, all that. It's an inclusive, you know, category. And certainly one of the things I think we'll be looking at as we consider all these different budget proposals is how, you know, the leverage points, for want of a better word or phrase, that fit into there.
This is Pete, within instruction, it also includes library, e-learning, teaching learning center, student media center, the staff of the instructional divisions, all of those, the deans, myself, et cetera. And Terrence, that does not include food services, correct?
That is correct. It does not include food services. It's just the operating budget. So, you know, we are making progress in terms of reducing our, you know, expense structure. I mean, we will save about $300,000 a year from that decision alone. So, you know, hard decision, but we are making some progress here. And one thing I think that you saw, and this is another thing that we on the executive team are going to have to take into consideration a bit as we review the various proposals, is to what extent do we look at our situation purely as, okay, we budgeted this and we have a $6.5 million structural deficit, and maybe 10.25 if Congress doesn't act. So do we say, okay, we're just going to go to zero based purely on budget? Or are we going to look at some of the history of the actuals and say, okay, well, let's try to tease out and figure out, are we finding ourselves consistently under budget often enough, and that we sort of take that into account as a savings, so that we can kind of find our way more mindfully to and intentionally to a sustainable future. So that's one of the things we have to figure out.
I'd like to add one other thing. Again, this is Pete. Another important contextual piece to this is that we essentially get the same amount per FTE from the state that colleges in less expensive counties and regions do. And that, I know that it's a difficult thing for the larger system to agree on, if you will. They agree on the numbers, but it creates factions within the larger group.
Mhm.
But we get the same per FTE roughly that Yakima County gets, which ended up being the lowest cost per living in the recent state survey from 2 years ago. We did get the 5% increase, regional pay increase, but that went directly into additional compensation. So that the context of the fact that we in King County get the same as the other colleges around the state is an important piece here as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one of the huge challenges the Seattle district has, and I'll bring in my outsider's point of view, because one of the things I was responsible for at my previous institution was labor negotiations, and as I would if I were in their shoes, the union representatives would come to us and say, "Well, look what this school is paying their staff and faculty, right?" And the school that was always highlighted was, the district was Seattle. And I remember sitting there and thinking, okay, well, I believe what they're saying. The data is here, it's published from the state and all this. And I don't know how they do it. And what I mean by that is, in my role, knowing the finances of our district, I was like, well, how can they get there? How can they actually pay this much? Because it's not that they shouldn't pay this much. I mean, we're all underpaid, right? Most of us are underpaid. It's just like, how do they actually make it work financially? And now that I've had some insight into your underlying finances, I understand, which is that basically for years, Seattle was the beneficiary of an allocation formula which gave it advantages relative to other schools. And about 5 years ago, they changed that formula, and your relative share of funding has kept dropping from the state. So that's part one of sort of the structural problem that we're sliding into. And then, of course, part two is you had a tremendous international program, especially at North, which is very high margin and stuff. So the revenues were disproportionately high for Seattle. And if it weren't for the fact that you had this, well, I mean, those two factors, the state allocation formula changing and the international population dropping, means that you're funded on basically the same basis as every other community college in the state. And you've got this cost structure which is higher than any other community colleges in the state.
Yes.
So it's a real challenge, which I'm sure that, we'll figure out. It's just going to be really challenging to figure it out.
And it's my understanding that was a contentious conversation amongst the Washington Community and Technical College members in the past, especially with regards to our 5%. But I have no doubt that we are probably bracing to have that conversation once again. We all believe in unity, but we also believe in serving our students equitably. And it's my understanding they were very upset with us about the 5%, but it was necessary. And so we're prepared to do what we need to do in the next cycle to make sure that there's some semblance of equity for Seattle colleges. So know that, and I'm going into this comment about future revenues and so on. We are addressing all of that. We are looking at additional grants. We're looking at reintroducing the conversation of equity for Seattle colleges versus the cookie cutter across the state. So any other ideas you all have, we would absolutely appreciate, because we are prepared to have this conversation. We have a few more minutes. Any more questions or comments?
I think we need a tree frog wave to feel better.
Oh yeah, I see. Not to be fun, Nico says that South has an otter wave. Just wondering about the tree frog wave. We can't mess this up. Are we doing the wave? I think everybody's on blank, so we can just kind of do the wave. But I don't know, do tree frogs wave or do they bounce? I think we should do a bounce. Anyway, so absolutely, and thank you for that. Nico, you know, it seems like we're beating a dead horse to leather on this one, and that was a very Texas phrase, and I apologize. But, you know, we wanna make it very clear what's happening and what we're doing to move forward to pull North out of this scenario. So we apologize if we've been depressing you every week. That was not our intent. We just want to make sure everyone understands exactly what has been happening, and also know that all of this is being memorialized so that 5 years from now, you won't have to search some random file cabinet or someone's brain and go, do you remember when and what we decided? Because we are documenting all of this for future administration. Pete, you had a comment?
Millicent makes a great point, which is a challenge that North faces particularly, which is with as many part-time students as we have, that's one FTE with 3 students is not the same as one FTE of 1 student when it comes
Absolutely.
to services.
That's right. That's right. It's absolutely, it's about that touch. You know, the FTE doesn't speak to the 3 touches for those 3 students. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. Very good point. Let's see. Everyone, hard as it is, this process is valuable. Are there any live questions? I think we've covered the chat, and please, I know Deandra, you're real good at checking me on that. I think we've covered every question in the chat. Are there any live questions? We have about 10 minutes left. Anyone who wants to speak up?
I have a question about the 5% increase. When the state gave that to us, there was talk that it might not last for more than 2 or 3 years, and then it would be the college that would have to cover it or something like that. Is that still an issue?
I'm going to have to go to the historians on this one. Terrence, do you recall? You were in the system, and Pete, do you recall?
I know it's not it's not an automatic. And there was some talk about shifting it locally, especially when the local funds conversation came up. The ability to use local funds. But other than that kind of disclaimer, I haven't heard any conversations since.
Right, nor have I in the WACTC group.
I had a question.
Sure, fire away.
So just in looking at, I remember doing some business case studies when I was going back through my MBA, and I recall a story about a college. It wasn't about college, but just how they had to reinvent themselves in the 90s. And have there been any look at lessons learned from other schools around the country that have been facing structural deficit issues that recovered, and what processes and methods they use to do that as we are looking to reframe ourselves for the long haul?
Yes, absolutely. We've been tied up in the dollars and cents, Lyle. But that's a very good question. The next part of this is to look at the structure and North moving forward and what North will look like moving forward. Pete and his team have been working on the instructional pieces. Tony Castro and her team have been working on the student services and wraparound services pieces, and as everyone else has been as well. There is no question, and I've said this before, that North will look different structurally in order to move this operation forward. We are also going to have discussions about possible sources of additional revenue, but we're approaching this strategically, so we don't want one conversation to cloud the other, because this numbers conversation is so intense, and we are all trying to get some balance here. And once we get past, the district part, the board approving the budget, and looking at all the people who have taken advantage of the opportunities employment-wise that are being offered, absolutely, we're looking at the structure of North, what it will look like moving forward, and again, that basket I talked about, what our portfolio looks like, our academic portfolio, so that in the future, when we have the ebbs and flows that we know are going to happen, we will be better prepared to handle those. So thank you. That's a great question. And I'm sure there'll be teams formed in the future to have those conversations. And so, Lyle, I've put your name down. as a member of one of those teams. We need all the input we can get.
Yeah, you know, obviously there's still some work to be done. But one thing, I guess I think there's, put it this way, I think this challenge is larger than North. That's just what I would say. So we talk about our decisions and how we structure ourselves and everything. I frankly think it extends to the entire district.
Yes. I
and-
agree with you. I agree with you. There's no question. And within the conversation about what North will look like, that is ever present. It has to be in our minds. I have no doubt that this district will have to restructure itself. There's no question. So I encourage you all to be engaged in the conversations, particularly the work sessions that are being held by the trustees, because we are being asked questions and there's a lot of research being done. So again, I would kind of bet lunch on it that this district in 3 years will look different than it does now.
A couple of things, this is Pete again, a couple of things to bring up. One, relative to those future conversations, let's all remember that we were already having future conversations with the guided pathways conversations. And so now we bring the guided pathways and the budget conversations in line to help us envision what the college of the future, North and the district looks like. Steve Leahy, thank you, Steve, for being here, is the district kind of legislative liaison. I know that's not your official title, Steve, but he put in the chat more information about the 5% that you may want to take a look at. Mm-hmm. And lastly, and I see, Steve, you just popped up, but lastly, let me say to Renee's point, that we are in instruction, as I know in other areas, looking to grow programs, bring in new programs where there is enrollment demand or where industry is demanding it. And so, Renee, don't have enough time to get into all of the examples on that, but I can share with people outside of this meeting. But please know that this is not just about cutting; it's also about reshaping and remolding.
Right,
Steve,
the future of North, absolutely.
Steve, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, just briefly, all the controversy around the regional pay was certainly real, but the case was made not only through the study that the Seattle colleges precipitated of comparing compensation across the state and cost of living and all of that, but it was through WFC, AFT Pro, AFT Beyond, and other state employees. There are something like 50,000 state of Washington employees in King County alone. All of them had the same adjustment made to address the cost of living issue. We were not singled out for that. So the reason I know we can't get too political in our discussions online here using state equipment, but that will be a political issue. Now the Democrats happen to occupy the leadership control of both the Senate and the House and the governor's office right now. They know who elects them, and so do the Republicans. So when I say one legislature cannot bind another, as much as they bake elements into their base budget, every time a legislature is brought, for the biennial budget development, which will be this January, that's going to be a bunch of new people and a bunch of old veterans. They start from scratch to say, okay, what would we do if we were starting all over again? And so zero basing is going to be, part of the methodology. But politically, I think, there's nobody that I see who is suggesting that somehow community college employees in King County, by having this 5% eliminated, would do much of anything to solve the state's budget problems.
Marla wrote, has there been a study that shows a savings by replacing full-time faculty with part-time faculty? And I would say that is a simple math calculation, but that I don't think is really something that is the way things are being thought of, because two reasons. One is there are a lot of costs that go with part-time faculty, because you have to administer, finding them, hiring them, the turnover, the scheduling, all that, that's more complex. And the other thing is, you know, I was participant or on a committee for a statewide efficiency study about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. And we brought in some consultants, and they did a huge amount of modeling and saying what actually makes a difference, what statistically, what data tells us has an influence on a student outcome. And the only thing they could come up with, but there was a relationship, was more full-time faculty. So I don't think that that's a focus.
Mm-hmm.
So
right, and in all transparency, Marla, I have not heard that in conversations that I've been a part of, that there is a preference for part-time versus full-time. I have not heard that. Pete, have you heard that?
I know in negotiations that we have a common shared understanding of the value of full-time relative to part-time, in that full-time, the colleges are making a commitment to the full-timers are making a commitment to the colleges. And so the students benefit from the extra attention that they can get from full-timers.
The consistency, sure.
The consistency. And please know that that is not a negative comment about part-time faculty. Having been a freeway flyer myself, I know that you spend time that you could be spending with students, you spend it driving from one college to the other. And yet we also have the very real cost difference between full and part-time. So we're trying to find a happy medium. The number of full-time faculty at North has ebbed and flowed from a high of around 110 to a low of the mid 80s. We're in the 90s now. I think that's a good place for North right now, and then we'll see what the re-envisioning looks like.
Okay, we are actually out of time. As Coral often reminds us, if you want to save if you want the comments in the chat, please save them. You will have to do the save on that. Let's see. Nicole Cook had a comment that we'll close out with. Has any effort been initiated to look into the market share lost by online learning from institutions not in the area, and how we can position ourselves to retake that market share? Sounds like a Pete question.
Yeah, we are starting to look at that, and I don't know if Kathleen or Ariana would want to chime in as well, but I know at the district VPI level, we are talking about that, not just in terms of how we're teaching to our students, but also how can we position ourselves in what looks like it's not going to end for a while, this new environment or this new context.
Thank you for that, Pete. Everyone, thank you so much for your wonderful questions, your full engagement. We have one more of these sessions, and then we will, of course, morph the conversation into the future of North as things progress. Thank you all again so much for attending this week. We hope you get to enjoy this beautiful weather, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you so much.